Hello and welcome everyone to the Trusted Data Summit and our session here on the criticality of controls in data management. So my name is MJ Khan. I'm the Director of Alliances at Data Gaps. And I have the pleasure of welcoming two of our guests, Sagar Thadi and Thadi Murali, to the stage. So a little bit of intros on them. Sagar Thadi, he's the Data Governance and Senior Manager at Freddie Mac. And he brings expertise in data management, business process design, software delivery, and project management from leading roles in the big four consulting firms and the financial sector. So he also specializes in data governance across the data supply chain, particularly with respect to regulatory audits, architecture redesign efforts, and data analytics. And then Thadi is a principal at Capco. Thadi directs and oversees financial risk, compliance, and data analytics sub-practice initiatives around control management, risk assessment, and related data analytics at Capco. He manages P&L responsibilities, serves as a trusted advisor to CROs, CCOs, and CDOs, and guides financial clients through collaboration to develop data, risk, and analytics solutions. Thadi also steers the implementation of large transformation projects surrounding data and risk. So, with no further ado, over to you, Thadi and Sagar. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. Our topic is criticality of controls and data management. And the way we are going to present this is I will talk of various principles, best practices, etc., around control management. And Sagar will talk more from an implementation expertise, bringing in various snippets from anecdotes from his experience in actually implementing this. So without further ado, let's start with slide one. Let's start with the index. So the way we laid it out, we wanted to keep this presentation very simple, but also cover some good ground. So the first two things are, what are controls? A lot of you may know them, but we thought it's worth repeating, and then talk about some of the key data risks, and then give some good examples on data controls, and then talk about some of the implementation of data management controls. And then finally, just talk, control redundancy is a huge topic, but just touch on it so that we get to know that controls are important, but also they're, you shouldn't overdo it because then it becomes more maintenance challenges. So that's our agenda for today. So let's start with, what are controls? Now, broadly, when we talk of controls, everyone probably has some idea what controls are. Maybe you face them in your organization. If you're a software developer, you probably don't see that so much. But if you're a organization, everything revolves around controls, because controls are those actions that mitigate risks, operational risks, data risks. Data is a huge asset in an organization. So any risks to data, whether it's security, integrity, those are all managed by controls. So these are critical components of a data ecosystem. Now, when we say controls, we mean anything that mitigates risks. That means it could be actions, it could be processes, it could be procedures, standards, frameworks, and feedback mechanisms. And to know what are the right kind of controls, we use a lot of industry standards. But to better explain controls, we used a little analogy here, medical analogy. So let's say you go to a doctor and you tell the doctor, look, I want to minimize the risk of any stomach issues, any stomach problems, any stomach pains. Then the doctor just doesn't start treating the stomach. He knows the stomach is part of a larger physiology. It's not just it's not just a piece of anatomy. So he has to worry about what you input, what you eat. So he looks at best practices around eating, around exercises. He looks at preventative medicines. And he also looks at monitoring you on a regular basis, blood tests, urine tests, so on. Same thing with controls. If you want to reduce the problems around data, you have to have some kind of a best practices frameworks to guide you. And then you need to have various preventative controls. We'll talk about some of them. Then various detective controls. We'll talk about some of them. But we need to see this holistically, and that's an important thing. And some of the popular frameworks, especially in US, is NIST. NIST is a good, it's got all kinds of controls. Um, it's a framework on all controls, but I think if you focus on the data related and the IT related and the cyber related, that covers a lot of the data controls. Then COBIT is another great framework that's a little high level, more from an IT strategy and so on. ISO is more global, but not used so much in US. COSO is another famous controls, is a very good framework, but it's more for process. So anyways, those are some guiding frameworks that you could leverage in your organization. And with that, let's just move on to some examples around controls. So before even getting into examples of controls, first we started with what are controls? And we said they are meant to mitigate risks. So the question to us is, what are data risks that we should be looking at? Which are the big data risks that we should all be concerned? So if you go to most literature on risks related to data, you'll find this famous triad, CIA. That is, I is for integrity, C is for integrity, meaning like accuracy, quality. So data should always be accurate and correct. Otherwise, that everything falls apart. Second thing, C means confidentiality. That means data should be secure, it should be protected. Then data should be available. Otherwise, it's no use. I mean, you should make sure you have backups and all that good stuff. But lately, there's been a lot, the last 5 years, and another thing besides the CI and A is privacy of data. So in your data risks, we mention all four: integrity, privacy, availability, and confidentiality. Privacy is all about individual information, so we have to protect that. Any organization which has individual information has to be very careful. That information, especially social security numbers, things like that, are well protected. Even addresses have to be protected, but maybe not as much as some of the other credit card, social security number. Those cannot be seen by anyone else. So these are the big data risks. And I also want to mention that, like, availability, confidentiality, this is largely managed by IT because they do the networks, they do the backups, they do all that stuff. But integrity and privacy is very much the focus of people who are involved in data movement, data technologies. You will be involved in this. You will be asked to help with these two things. So I'll focus a little bit more on these two, integrity and privacy.
Thadi, you do a fantastic job with explaining the controls. That's why we love you so much here at Freddie Mac. And it's always been a pleasure to work with you. And I also want to thank the Data Gaps team for graciously hosting us today. Regarding your statement on the control frameworks, that's absolutely valid. It really depends on the organizations. It depends on the organizational focus. Of course, at a company like Freddie Mac, for example, the COBIT framework, the NIST frameworks, these are relied upon, quite heavily, especially when it relates to some of our SOX controls, the SOX IT controls. We have some flavor of the COSO frameworks as well, because those are process level controls. And then when you get into our general IT general controls, like anything around, access, authentication, network security, and those types of controls, then there's a reliance on the NIST framework, which is also heavily used by the federal government as well. And it's also important to note that organizations will look at these frameworks and generally translate those to organization-specific standards and policies, and then that sort of facilitates the kind of overall implementation of those frameworks. And just one more thing before we go back to where you left off, Thadi. This space, as you know, Thadi, and I'm sure a lot of folks on the call, this is a very, very rapidly changing space. This is highly evolutionary in nature. Why I say that is because, number one, regulations change all the time. There's always a new regulation, especially in the US and various other countries. Regulations are the driving force around these controls, and it trickles down to data and technology and so on and so forth. If you think about it, let's just the most obvious example is SOX itself. Maybe 30 years ago, how organizations approached financial processes and accounting processes, that was largely different to now. Once the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation was enacted, the whole paradigm shifted. That's one example. The other very obvious examples are around the privacy space. I think a lot of you would be familiar with that. When the European Union came out with the GDPR, the way organizations approach privacy-related data, consumer data, that paradigm also shifted. So these are, constantly in flux, and that's the beauty of it. We have to stay on our tone. Practitioners like Thadi, myself, and everybody else on this call, we have to be on our toes. But it keeps things very fascinating. The other aspect I want to note about the regulatory change is that because of regulation, the scope of data that requires control can also change. So, nowadays, before it's like we have a huge, large emphasis on privacy, but today I can tell you, frankly speaking, there's also a growing focus on ESG. Environmental, social, and governance data. I think that's a large segment of data that's going to come into focus. So expect more controls, more requirements to come from this. And the other aspect I want to mention just really briefly is technology. We're living in a rapidly evolving world with the advent of things like the cloud, with data lakes, lake houses, APIs, streaming, big data, Hadoop. Just the sheer volumes of data that we process will also require the risk management, control management folks just trying to really have to really stay on our toes, just to kind of match and adapt to the evolving landscape. So that's the piece that I wanted to cover. But Thadi, please let me hand it back over to you.
No, that's all good. So I think we talked about the key data risks. And then we said, hey, availability and confidentiality control, those risks are mainly managed by IT. Data integrity and privacy is very much in the hands of people who are in the show, mostly because they're probably more into data management. And then we talked about some of the key things you're going to focus when you talk about data integrity. And there are many things in integrity, but I will talk about the big ones. Accuracy, that means just making sure data is correct. Completeness, that means making sure it's complete, there's no nulls and all that stuff. And it's consistent. Why is consistency so important? Because data moves. Data doesn't stay in one place. It's like water. It flows from one system to another system to another system. And as it goes from system to system, things may get changed. And we need to make sure that it's consistent. That if you look across, yes, you can change it, but it's consistently flowing from one place to another. That means the changes are done at a place where everyone else can benefit from the changes. So we'll talk more about consistency, but just making sure that across the organization, if you ask for a piece of data, it is the same across the organization. So that is the key thing about consistency. So we'll get more into that. Sagar, you want to add to here?
Yeah, I mean, just really briefly, I think, Thadi, to your point, as data management professionals, I think the focus from folks like us, on our teams and other various teams in other companies, would largely be on the integrity aspect and the privacy aspect. Of course, some degree of confidentiality. Especially for me, I work in finance. Data integrity is a very, very critical dimension that we look at. Because our financial reports have to be absolutely spot on. So each of those dimensions you walked us through, Thadi, highly important. The other, the dimensions that you had there, like availability, confidentiality, while it's a team effort, the data management folks, the business lines, everybody works in tandem, and we may obviously provide our opinions. The responsibility for those largely rests on some of our IT teams, information security teams, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's what I just wanted to chime in there with, Thadi. Go ahead.
Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, let's take some examples. And these examples, we will cover all kinds of data risks. So let's take, so when you, so we'll, the best way to explain controls is to look at risks. And the best way to explain risks is to explain through scenarios. So if you look at the first scenario, we are talking about an external or internal party. That is the threat agent. So in any scenario, you'll see me saying, where is the threat agent, or who is going to cause this risk? Who is it we are watchful against? Then what is the asset that's at risk? In all these cases, data, so I won't repeat that. But the threat agent could be internal party or external party, and the risk scenarios, they could get access to information like social security number or credit card. By the method they would go is by looking into databases or screens, and they would get personal information. So how do we stop that? So what kind of risk it is? This is privacy risk, so that is clear. And what do we do in terms of controls? So it doesn't mean that one control is for one risk. You could have many controls to just mitigate one risk. So for this risk, we need controls like identifying where our privacy information is, making sure those elements are encrypted in our databases. If they're showing on screen, then we make sure they're masked so that not everything is shown, just the last 4 digits, things like that. So those are examples of controls. Let's take another example. Here again, the agent is an internal or external party, and we are worried about them getting access to our data, so resulting in data losses. So that's what we call a confidentiality risk, because the previous one was social security number, that's individual information, so it's privacy, but this is confidentiality. This is for any data, not just for individual information. So here, our controls are more around authentication, like passwords and so on. But even once you get into the system, authorization, what are you entitled to look at, reading, writing, things like that. Then the third scenario is the threat agent is not individual, but could be an individual, but mainly we're talking about storms, hurricanes, but also terrorist attacks, cyber attacks. So those are the individuals, but those are the threat agents, and asset again is data. But because of those disasters, we could have, like it happened in New York in the Sandy storm. A lot of the companies didn't have access to their applications and data. So how do you manage that? So the control would be to have backups, redundant servers, and so on. And the final one scenario is more about integrity, that is, data is not correct or not accurate, and the threat agent is an internal party. Someone has just typed it wrong, fat fingers, instead of putting $1,000 they put $1 million or 10,000. It happens all the time. I mean, those things. So how do you make sure our data, when it's transferring from one database to another, something got incorrectly transferred? So those are issues. Those are those are the risks of integrity. How do you control that? We talked about consistency, accuracy, and completeness controls, so we'll discuss that more, but that's how we talk. That's how we manage that. Now, Sagar, you want to quickly add? I think we are kind of a little short of time, so I'm trying to rush a little bit.
No, I think yeah, sure, Thadi. This will be quick. The first point that you have there, classification. I just want to mention one thing. That's a very important mechanism for organizations, because you can only control what you know is out there. Classifications is a means to identify your sensitive data, and organizations typically will have a scheme around classification, and that just means you have tiers of classification based on the degree of sensitivity. So you might have some things that are very, very guarded, closely guarded, restricted, highly confidential data, and then you have something that's on the opposite side of the spectrum, something that's public information. This type of initial classification is highly beneficial for organizations, because you understand what you're dealing with, but you can also prioritize where you apply the controls. Because again, to Thadi's point that he made earlier, implementing controls it does require some cost, and there's maintenance efforts involved, so you have to be a bit selective, and classification is a way to kind of get there. And you have various inventories and repositories across your organization for tracking that type of information. Authentication, this is generally a centralized, in most organizations you have an identity and access management system that has those details. Authorization, because this involves people and roles, and those change all the time. This typically requires some form of regular certification and things along those lines. Availability, I think Thadi gave some very good examples on just having backups and an appropriate business continuity plan, disaster recovery plan in the event of any unforeseen type of events that could confront an organization, like the natural disaster event that Thadi mentioned. So that's one thing that's also there, but generally handled by our infrastructure and IT teams, information security teams. And then, of course, integrity. As I mentioned, this is something that, in most business lines, in financial teams, in your capital market teams, just the accuracy and the quality of your data remains to be very, very critical, because that ultimately can have severe consequences if there are problems there. So these are highly important controls along these different dimensions and scenarios.
Yep. So let's go on to the next one. Here we will start talking about more about controls, and give some examples where, when we implement a control, where do you implement, what kind of control do you implement, things like that. So let's take the first example. This is more transfer of data between systems. So if you look at the way I wanted you to look at this diagram and this slide is, if you look at the the right hand side, where you have some pictures, think of that as three systems. Yeah, we call it application 1, application 2, application 3. Data is entered in application 1 or database 1, and then it's copied to application 2 or database 2, then it's copied to database 3, and then from there some reports are generated. Just let's assume that. So this is how the flow is. And this is the same in all examples, so it's easy. So it's the same thing. So now we're going to just talk about data management controls, because that's our focus. So here, data is flowing like this. We gave an example here that it shouldn't say risk scenario, it's more a control scenario where there's a reconciliation job. This is a control, is that we want to control, if there are two systems, we want to check between system A and system B and check if the data is correct. We want to make sure if it's being copied from a source system to a target system, the data is correct. And the check is always done in the target system. So we don't do it in the source system. The target system would know, hey, am I correct with the source system? So in this kind of situation, since we have three applications, the control would be not in application one, but the target system application two, and then it's flowing from application two to application three, so target system there. And these are consistency checks because we want to just make sure that the data from A is same in data in B, or the application two is the same as data in application one, and data in application three is the same as in data in application two. So that is a consistency check. Now, the second example is an accuracy check. We want to make sure data is correct. So here is an example where Jill, she wants to enter data into a system on mortgage data, loan data, and her data is reviewed or checked by her manager for correctness. And if I ask you what kind of a control is this, then the answer is accuracy, because she's trying to just check in system one and she's trying to make sure the data is correct. There's no point in checking, and we'll come to that later, but the accuracy is always done at the system where data is entered. In the third case, they are trying to get various kinds of statistics, checking data for errors. They're checking on all kinds of systems. They're doing accuracy checks. They're doing consistency checks. Where would you have these controls? And the answer is you can have it in all three systems. A fourth check is you go over the data, wherever it's null, you're changing the value to 0, just in this example. What kind of a check is that? That's a completeness check. We just want to make sure data is not missing, things like that. So we want to correct that. In this particular case, if you get it correct in data in system 1, then system 2 and system 3 will automatically get the same data and they'll be correct, they'll be fine. So we showed the control only in system 1. Then privacy. That is, if there are some confidential individual information, we want to encrypt that. So where do you put the controls? Put it in system 1. Since it's flowing to system 2, put it also in system 2, put it also in system 3. So this is an example of how controls are implemented, where you put the controls, what kind of controls you put, depending on what kind of scenario it is. And this is, hopefully this gives you a flavor of controls. Sagar, you want to add to this?
No, I think Thadi, this is a really good example, and I've seen this on a very frequent basis. Where I work in my previous roles and so on. I do want to just quickly ask you one question, Thadi, because just wanted to clarify one thing on. So on the second example, the accuracy controls at the source. Could you just explain that one in just a little bit more detail? If you have data that's manually entered at the source but moves to a different system and there are transformations applied there, what are your thoughts on whether you have another type of accuracy control where the transformation is taking place beyond just the source? Just want to get your thoughts on that, and I think that'll also give another additional example to the audience as well.
Yes, so exactly, very good question. So wherever data is entered or data is updated, you need to have accuracy controls. So in this particular example, we kept it simple and said data is only entered in system 1, but system 2 and system 3 is just copied. So we don't need accuracy control. But let's say, like Sagar said, hey, data is entered in system 1. So we need an accuracy control there. But when the data is copied to system 2, application 2, someone goes and modifies it because they need it for whatever, they need to do that. It's part of the business process. Then at that point, you need another accuracy control because data is now modified. So you will need an accuracy control in application 2. And let's say application 3, you're not just copying it, but you're also further changing the data. Then you need another accuracy control in application 3. So whenever data is entered or updated, so wherever data is created or updated, you need accuracy control.
Yep.
Where data is just copied, not changed, just copied to create a report or whatever, then you need a consistency control. If you're a data warehouse or something, and you're just pulling data from the main systems but not changing it, then you just need a consistency control. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks,
The
Thadi. That's a great,
accuracy
great
part
example.
should be done by the system of the original systems. All
Okay.
right, sounds good. We have, let's go to the last slide. Now here, obviously we talked of controls and putting controls everywhere, and we could go overboard on this, and sometimes because controls have to be managed too. They have to be tested. They have to be checked if everything is working. They have to be monitored. You need to have reports. You need to have dashboards checking all these things. Now, if you put too many controls, it becomes too much maintenance. So we want to give you some examples to show when controls can be too much. And that is just this. I mean, this topic is very vast, but we've given you some examples so that you get a flavor of it in this presentation. So here, again, we did similar kind of example. Data is entered in system one, it moves to system two, and then it moves to system three. System two, they just integrate this data, and system three, they're just creating some reports just for this example. So data is only entered in system one. That's the only place where data we need an accuracy control. So in this example, if you see you see the alphabet A, so that's an accuracy control. You need that in system one. System two and system three, we just need to be consistent. And if you have three controls, it's okay, not a bad thing. Or some people may say, look, I don't want to do everywhere. I'll just have an accuracy control in system one. I'll have a consistency control in system three, where I'll just check if that system matches with system one. That's also okay. There's no problem with that. It's just trying to minimize controls, but it meets your purpose. If your system three is fine, that means they must have copied. And if you check that with system one, that means the system two is fine. They must have automatically, it means because data is flowing from system one to system two to system three. Now, the third thing is, in this particular example, the controls, they put an accuracy control in system one, a consistency control in system one, they put an accuracy and a consistency in system two, system three. This is too much. There's no reason to put an accuracy control in all three. If you put it in system one, then that makes sure data is correct. If you put a consistency control in system two and system three, that means data is flowing correctly from system one to system two and system three. So here, this is too many controls. So hopefully this gives you a flavor of thinking about controls. And this is just an example. There's much more to this topic, but we wanted to just give you a flavor. Sagar, you want to add to this?
No, Thadi, I think this is a really, really good case in point example, because sometimes I have seen instances where there's more steps than necessary in the control process. And to your point, controls are, the auditors are also looking at your control testing, how you maintain the controls, how effective they are, and those types of efforts. So any opportunity to optimize is highly welcomed in organizations. So that's kind of one piece I wanted to add. I think there are some questions that I've seen on the comment side. Thadi, do you want to maybe take up any of those?
Yes, let's do that. So thank you. And please type in. So I'm seeing this question from Narendra. He said, do financial organizations in US follow BCBS guidelines for risk data aggregation and management? I think by BCBS, I think you're referring to Basel guidelines, which is specific for financial industry, I think. So yes, of course. Many U.S. organizations are global organizations, and also even in U.S., Basel guidelines are excellent. But remember, Basel guidelines are principles. They're not frameworks. Principles are, hey, make sure your data is good. That's a principle. Make sure your data is correct. That's a principle. Now, framework is more like, okay, to make data is has good quality, please look at accuracy. Please make sure you're checking this. Please make sure you're consistency, checking between sources, between source and target, reconciling, things like that. They get into the control details. So BCBS guidelines or BCBS principles are absolutely important, and financial organizations in US definitely follow it. Freddie, of course, is a federal. It's more just US specific, so it doesn't. It doesn't exactly follow BCBS, but it has similar guidelines from its regulator. But it's all similar. I mean, they BCBS guidelines are also adopted by federal organizations. So it's those are good principles. Yeah, but most US organizations, other than they follow that. So next question: what are some of the penalties or costs for not having proper controls? So the first thing is it's bad for the organization itself. Like if you don't have good controls, you could have problems with your financial statements. You could have problems with your own data. You could be more susceptible to like cyber attacks. That's confidentiality controls, privacy attacks. Especially personal individual information, data losses, data loss preventions. Personal data going out, especially when we're dealing with third parties. All those things. Anytime this kind of breach happens, it becomes national news, and there's all kinds of penalties and lawsuits. But other than that, even the regulators will put huge fines, because especially if you report something wrong, you put your calculations wrong, your capital calculations, you make any mistakes there are huge penalties. And it could be not just a penalty saying, hey, please correct it, you're fined this much. It could be almost as bad as cease and desist. That means don't stop operations, or you can't expand, or you can't do certain things till you correct that. So that there could be huge that kind of business implications. So cease operations till you correct it, that kind of stuff. So those are huge. Yep.
And also one thing, Thadi, just to add to that, is also just the reputational damage can be quite severe.
Yes.
You may have lost business opportunities as a result of this, loss of investor confidence in your company, and the list goes on. So, but it's a great
Customer
question.
confidence. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we covered the two questions. We can have more.
Yeah. No, thank you, Thadi and Sagar, for answering those questions. Very helpful for the audience. So all it leaves for me to say is, Thadi and Sagar, thank you so much for a very informative session. I think it's very useful. And thank you for answering these questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having us.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Thank you.